Hello, I'm Dr. Betina Yanez, an associate professor at the Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine and member of the Robert H. Lurie Comprehensive Cancer Center. I will be presenting on enhancing recruitment and retention in cancer clinical trials. Before I begin, I would like to disclose that I am a consultant for Blue Note Therapeutics. I would like to begin by providing a little bit of background on the significance of cancer disparities in the U.S. So the good news is that we're seeing an increasing number of cancer survivors, and the number of cancer survivors in the U.S. is expected to increase to over 20 million by the year 2026. However, there are still several racial ethnic disparities that remain, and these disparities are the result of an interplay of structural, socioeconomic, cultural, behavioral, biological factors. For example, we continue to see higher rates of mortality among prostate and colorectal cancers for African American and Black patients in the U.S. And when it comes to patient-reported outcomes, we also see disparities. One example is that Hispanic and Latina breast cancer survivors report poor health-related quality of life when compared to non-Hispanic white women. We also see a high level of unmet needs among select racial ethnic minority groups in the U.S. That are specific to cancer survivors. So here's some data from a colleague, Dr. Patricia Moreno, down at the University of Miami, where she explored unmet needs among Hispanic and Latinx cancer survivors. And she found specifically among breast cancer, Hispanic and Latinx cancer survivors that there was a very high level of unmet needs, specifically among the psychological domain for these survivors. Prostate and colorectal cancer survivors who also identified as Hispanic and Latinx also had were also reported several unmet needs across different domains, but specific to breast cancer patients, we see that they have a high level of unmet psychological needs. So despite really the documented disparities that we see among racial ethnic minority groups in the U.S., we're still seeing underrepresentation in cancer research among these groups. So approximately 20% of clinical trials will fail due to lack of participant enrollment, and racial and ethnic minority groups and rural groups as well are often underrepresented in cancer research. Minorities are underrepresented in FDA trials, and it often takes longer to recruit racial and ethnic minority patients into cancer clinical trials. So why is underrepresentation a problem? Well, participants in clinical trials should represent the patients that will be using these medical treatments. People of different ages, races, ethnicities, it's important that they inform treatment and intervention development because they might be responding differently to treatments. Our results might be biased from our research and have limited generalizability if we don't have diverse samples and we don't have enough of a sample size and representation from different groups to do secondary analyses across these different groups. And we just don't know what we're missing until we begin to diversify our research studies. Representation in clinical trials matters. For those of you who attended ASCO, this is actually some data from the ECOG Akron trial E1Z11. It's a prospective validation of genetic predictors of aromatase inhibitor-associated musculoskeletal symptoms in a diverse cohort of breast cancer patients. And one of the results that they reported on was that more Asian and Black women developed severe musculoskeletal pain after starting or initiating aromatase inhibitors when compared to white women. What was even more interesting was that the rates of aromatase inhibitor discontinuation were actually similar across the groups, even though there was difference in the level of musculoskeletal pain by racial ethnic groups. So there's going to be, I think, some good reasons to explore why we have those differences by group. But I think that data from this publication really underscore the significance of being able to recruit and retain diverse groups of cancer survivors in our research trials. So when it comes to adding diversity into clinical trial and just in general cancer research enrollment, I think it starts with maybe diversifying the team. So thinking about, especially if you have an interest in working with Hispanic and Latinx population, thinking about having a bilingual staff and training your staff in cultural competency, having collaborations with key stakeholders and individuals in the community from the beginning of the project, and thinking about having a patient advisory council or a community advisory board that informs the scope of your research from its inception, ideally from the part where you're actually writing a grant or have a proposal in mind, and getting that key input from various stakeholders from the very beginning. There's a couple things to consider when it comes to your study methods or approach. Incentives, are you incentivizing patients? Are you able to budget for incentives, especially when participants are completing lengthy questionnaires or assessments? Helping overcome any costs that are barriers to trial participation, whether it's budgeting for transportation, having, reimbursing for Uber or Lyft, or providing parking associated costs, vouchers for meals, lodging for participants who are coming in from a long distance and have to spend, one night or 2 nights near the medical center. And these incentives, it's best when they're budgeted at the beginning of the project rather than at the end of the project, when it's probably impossible or really hard to reallocate the budget. When it comes to recruiting and consenting, I recommend decoupling recruitment and even consenting from the clinicians and leaving that to study recruiters, and training all recruiters to approach all of their patients equally, and even think of any implicit biases that recruiters might be having when it comes to approaching patients. And navigating the consent process, think about the level of readability of your consent forms. It's something that my team and I talk about a lot. The language in our consent form, all of the language in our onboarding and patient-facing materials. At what reading level is it? Is it patient-centered? Is it, something that patients will generally think of as approachable? Helping patients navigate the risk to benefit ratio, especially among earlier phase clinical trials, offering consent and study information in multiple languages, and having patient advocates, help you with tailoring this information and giving initial feedback on everything from even the study name to, what the consent forms are like, how they're going to come across to patients, especially diverse patients, how onboarding materials are going to be received. I think that's all really important for patient recruitment and, ultimately retention in the study, and even considering electronic consent forms for patients who are farther away. That remoting option can also make it a little bit easier to get more people into research. When it comes to study eligibility criteria, I think part of the problem is having a very strict eligibility criteria. And while there could be really good scientific justification for that, maybe thinking about eliminating patients with comorbidities can often lead to a disproportionate exclusion of minority patients in clinical trials. So there might be an opportunity as a trial advances across different stages to broaden eligibility criteria in the later stages of research trials or during a pragmatic trial phase. Thinking about study design too, and I think this is where one's statistician can be really important to help with design considerations. Placebo control designs can often limit enrollment, especially among underrepresented and racial ethnic minority groups. So for those of us who do behavioral research, SMART and MOST designs can also be something to consider, a stepped care approach where all patients start at one level and step up different levels of care depending on how they're doing throughout the trial. So these are just different considerations to think about so that the majority or all patients get at least some level of care or intervention or gain, as opposed to half of the participants getting nothing, which is oftentimes what discourages patients from enrolling into research trials. And then thinking about how we approach patients about research. This was a quote that's taken from a paper that was published in Cancer, where the group of investigators for this study was where they were trying to explore and try and better understand how patients are approached, especially diverse and racial ethnic diverse patients, how they're approached about cancer research trials. And this is a quote from a clinician who said, "I try anytime I'm speaking with an African American patient to be aware of the history of abuses that have taken place in this country, particularly in the African American population." And so, I try very hard to explain the trial well. What's the rationale for the trial? Why are we doing this trial? And, I want to be very clear. It's just the way I am, but I want to be very clear with my African American patients about what's up in the trial and why it might be of interest to them or relevant to them to participate. When it comes to patient education and some retention strategies, tailoring marketing strategies can be really important. So whether you're recruiting through ads, posters, social media, whatever types of recruitment tools you have, thinking about, the aesthetics of that. What does it look like? What type of patient groups are you targeting? Are they represented in your social media or your ads? If you want to get patients who speak Spanish, are you also making sure that all of your patient-facing materials, recruitment stuff, and, engagement materials, are they in, Spanish as well? Monthly or quarterly newsletters with study updates for enrolled patients can also be a useful strategy, and ultimately giving feedback and reporting the study findings back to the patients is also an important strategy for patients to be interested in research and potentially want to stay in research or enroll in future research trials once they're given feedback on how the trial went and what effort, what sort of contributions all of their time and energies and effort went to. And here I have some screenshots of a website that we developed here at Northwestern Medicine as part of a study that we call Impact for managing symptoms among individuals who've been diagnosed with cancer. And we have the website available in English and in Spanish. And I'm going to actually play a video in Spanish. I'll play the first minute of the patient onboarding video in Spanish.
Hola y bienvenidos a My Northwestern Medicine Care Corner. Mi nombre es Marcos y estoy aquí para presentarte el nuevo sitio web de My Northwestern Medicine Care Corner. Si eres como yo, querrás más información sobre cómo manejar los síntomas y preocupaciones comunes del cáncer, información sobre cómo mejorar tu salud en general, durante y después del tratamiento del cáncer. My Northwestern Medicine Care Corner proporciona a pacientes como yo el conocimiento y las herramientas que necesito para controlar mis síntomas y mejorar mi bienestar. Como parte de mi cuidado en el Centro del Cáncer Northwestern Medicine, completo un breve cuestionario de evaluaciones de síntomas y necesidades antes de mi cita médica.
So I will wrap this up by saying I think we have a lot of work to continue helping patients enroll and retaining patients in cancer research and ensuring equity and access to research. And it really starts with increasing diversity in the oncology workforce, tailoring interventions to specific communities and populations, and that goes above and beyond just doing, interventions and providing information in Spanish and in different languages, but also thinking about cultural factors and how that might relate to patients' participation in cancer research. For those of us who recruit using MyChart or patient portals, ensuring that patient portals are available in multiple languages so that we get Spanish speakers enrolled in our cancer research trials as well, and minimizing reading, literacy, audio and visual concerns with study participation. And then finally, I'll just end on some resources. Northwestern actually has a website through NewCats. It's the Clinical and Translational Sciences Institute that has some information about recruiting and engaging patients in research. I often point people to Duke's website because they have this Recruitment Innovation Center with lots of great resources as well. So that's another great website to check out. Readable, which offers some services on making sure that any information presented to patients is really readable, it's digestible, it's clear. So just different considerations before you begin, your research trials. And that's it. Thank you so much for your time. And if you have questions, here is my email.
Thank you, Dr. Yanez. There was so much good information and resources packed in there. We really appreciate it. Anybody who has questions, please feel free to post them to the Q&A or to the chat. I have like a conundrum for you, and I was just wondering if you have any thoughts. I mean, as a researcher, I'm always, of course, trying to recruit, and I really want my populations to be diverse because I want, everybody in there and accounted for, and I want to generalize broadly. If I were, a clinician out in the field somewhere, outside the, downtown area, I feel like I probably would have patients who could benefit from being in research because they would get access to things that they might not otherwise have access to. How would I know that these things exist and suggest that my patients consider them? Like, I feel there's a disconnect there between the research that's going on and the people who can benefit from it, or refer people who can benefit.
Thank you, Dr. Rainey. I think you bring up a really good point. I've actually had emails. I don't know how patients navigate through clinicaltrials.gov, but I've had patients email me throughout the Chicagoland area that they found some of our research either through a website. So through Northwestern will often, make information about clinical trials known. Somehow patients find us through clinicaltrials.gov. I think symposiums like this where we talk about our research, at least in the Chicagoland area, and we can kind of get the word out through different newsletters and patient-facing materials. And then other clinicians can learn about our research projects. I would love like a database locally where we can kind of post. This is just me having dreams. There's probably more work that I'm putting on my desk, but I sort of have this great idea of kind of a website where we can talk about all of the local research projects too, so that clinicians can be aware of, categorized by clinical trials and behavioral studies, what's available. As you know, now at Northwestern Medicine, we're also trying to alert patients to different research projects through MyChart, which is a relatively new initiative where patients will have the opportunity, if they opt in, to receive a few messages about potentially eligible trials and then take that to their clinicians to talk about it some more. That does put a little bit more of the work on the patient than the clinician being aware of it and saying, oh, I'm going to refer you to this trial. But that's a new feature that we're testing out in some of my studies to see kind of how that works, and if putting that awareness on more patients can help have clinicians be more aware of some of the research projects happening through Northwestern Medicine as well.
Yeah,
it's a great question. There's a lot of research out there too, between different types of early phase clinical trials, behavioral research. There's just so much happening, and it's hard for clinicians to kind of keep tabs on all of it.
I get that. We have a question up on the Q&A board. I want to come back to that too, but I want to make sure that we get this question. It's a really important one. So somebody in the audience asks, I've had more discussions with patients about mistrust in research prompted by COVID vaccine hesitancy. Do you think we've learned anything through the pandemic about how to do this better?
Wow, that is such an important question. I don't know if I can do justice to this question or address it all right now. But what I have experienced in the past year or so is because of the pandemic, and I think a lot of the socio-political events that we've had happen in the past couple of years. The topic of medical mistrust has been something we've been talking a lot more about, and that I hear it more from patients too. And I think misinformation is something that's becoming more popular, and that it's on us. as clinicians, as scientists, healthcare providers, to really find ways to provide digestible, evidence-based information, whether it's about vaccines or cancer clinical trials, enrollment in research, because there's just so much misinformation out there. And I think what we've learned in the past year to year and a half is how much this information is affecting our patients, and that we need to be doing a much better job. So that's been my takeaway. I lose sleep over it. I'm still thinking about how to do that. But Chris, you and I have had these conversations about, we do a lot of patient-centered interventions where we're providing a lot of education to patients about survivorship topics, thriving post-transplant, and how we can break some myths that patients have been, learning about, where to find evidence-based resources and information, and the challenges that we face when there's so much out there on the internet that other people are talking about that's, kind of hard to break into that.
Yeah, definitely. So it's an ongoing problem. I want to go back to your mention of you'd have this dream of having like a central place where people can come and find studies, because we've talked about this too. And maybe is it so much of a dream that we couldn't do something like that? But I'd like to hear from people who are in attendance, if there was a place where you could go and find studies that your patients might benefit from. Is that something that you would use? Or like, it would be good to get some guidance if we were to build something where people could come and look, they've got a patient with a great deal of distress or certain kind of symptom. Is there a trial that's open that could get them some new and developing treatment that may benefit them? Is that something that people would use to get their patients into trials? Or is that just kind of a pie in the sky sort of plan? I mean, it would really be helpful to know. So anybody who wants to post a comment about that would be incredibly helpful to know about.
This is Sheetal, but it always sounds so good, because it is so hard for patients to navigate this. They have no idea how to start. It's because it's really hard. Yeah. The problem with it may work in certain types of studies. More and more of our oncology treatment studies are slot based. So they're based on mutations and molecular changes that are very small. They're done at many, many, many centers. And oftentimes it's like, here Northwestern, here's one spot. And so on a given day, I may not even know if there is a spot open for my patients. I have to just check with the coordinator. So it's so complicated. It's so complicated, but I always, my pie in the sky dream is always that maybe we can't search for the trial, but to have very deep connections with the centers that have the trials. So it's easy for an oncologist sitting in clinic to connect with someone, at least maybe in your affiliate sites or your region. I'd love to see something in Chicago like that. But it's not so easy with the way treatment trials are. It may be different for behavioral though.
Well, yeah, I think for survivorship, it might be different, right? Especially when we're talking about, maybe thriving and coping, adherence to endocrine therapies, the different types of trials specifically for survivorship might kind of lend itself better to that sort of a database.
I
especially
agree.
Because survivors don't come in as often, right? Maybe they come in twice a year. They feel a little bit less connected to the healthcare system, to their providers, but having sort of a database where they can be like, oh, there's an intervention here that will, talks about acupuncture for cancer survivors and pain, et cetera, or coping, dealing with fear of recurrence, et cetera. So I think you bring up a really good point. It might be a little bit more dependent on the type of research and the stage in which a patient is or where they are along the cancer continuum.
That's a really good point. And we've got somebody who posted on the Q&A board about the fact that people in support groups are often asking about trials, and maybe we should tap into support groups more. So people who are already activated. Yeah,
that's actually a really good point. I've talked about that with one of our a former colleague who ran one of our support groups, and we've tried to balance, like, the support group is such a safe place for patients to feel heard, make connections. And, you know, as a psychologist myself, I've always wondered, like, if I don't want to break that safe space. So that's something I've just wondered about. I completely agree, though, that support groups are great places, but how we do that in a way that maintains the integrity of that very safe space for our patients is something I haven't figured out yet. So I welcome, you know, ideas and feedback via email on how to do that.
That's a really good.
Put a brochure with the trials outside the door so it doesn't go in the room unless somebody brings it in.
Interesting, yeah.
Even then, we have some, you know, just posting stuff in our hospital. There's a lot of barriers to that too. So that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
we can problem solve this. And one last thing before we move on, Sophia has mentioned that there is an organization called Capricorn. This gets a prize for good acronyms. Chicago Area Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Network. It's a partnership across local healthcare organizations that can be leveraged. So something that we can definitely look into, because I think this would be like a win-win situation for everybody involved if we can figure out some sort of solution. But thank you so much for all the comments. Thank you, Betina, for your presentation and all the really good ideas.